All right, so far everything we've been talking about is utilizing something that is export default. Okay? The default export of some file or module, as we saw in the case of jQuery. Okay? Now, if you can only export and import one thing from every file, that kind of sucks. So there are ways to export and therefore import multiple things from the same file. So to demonstrate this, let's make one more file. And we'll call that file math.js. Everyone's favorite subject. All right, so in our math.js, we can write a few different functions that do different math operations. Don't worry, we'll keep it simple. We'll only do things like sine and cosine, tangent, that kind of thing. We'll just add addition and subtraction, maybe a little multiplication and division. All right, so something we do that's different is we say export, and then we do not use default. Okay, we just say export, and then we create a function. Now, whether it's a function or a variable, because you can actually export any data type, anything that can be stored in a variable can be exported to another file. It could be a string, it could be a number, it could be a function, it could be an object, it could be a class. Anything that can be stored in a variable, you can export. All right? But we'll stick with functions for this example, and we'll say export function. Now, when you're doing this type of export without default, it has to have a name. And that's how you distinguish what you want to import into the other file is by its name. So these are called named exports. Okay? So if we want to make a function add, that then takes x and y, and then return x plus y. All right, so this is a named export. And we could have as many of these as we want. So let's go ahead and make one more before we switch back to the other file. So we'll do the exact same thing, but for subtraction. So we'll say export function subtract. Knew I'd get it eventually. All right, so now we have multiple things in one file being exported. And like I already mentioned, you could have unlimited things. There's no real limit other than a practical one on how many things you could export from a single file. Now, one thing to keep in mind, because of the way React is structured, most of the time we'll be doing export default. Okay, so the majority of the time, each file is going to do kind of one thing. Okay, but you still need to know the difference between export default and a named export, because it's going to be very important down the road. So that's how we define named exports, and then to use them is a little bit different on the import statement. Does anybody still need a second here? Everyone's good? So now if we go back over to our index.js, and up at the top, your import statements should always be at the top of the file. Okay? And they cannot, you can never, inside of your front end code, you cannot import stuff inside of brackets or anything. They have to be on the outermost scope of that file. So I cannot write an if statement and then put an import statement inside of it. It doesn't work that way. Okay? And for the most part, the order of your import statements do not matter, especially when it comes to when you're importing JavaScript files. The order does not matter. There, like most things in coding, there's a few exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, the order doesn't matter. All right, and what we're going to do different now is we're going to say curly brackets, and we'll go ahead and finish this from, and then this directory math. When you're doing named imports, okay, you get a little side benefit from writing out the whole statement first, because now when I go to type inside the curly brackets, it'll give me autocompletes and stuff that file or module exports. So if I start to type add, I should see add comes up, and it actually tells me what the definition of it was. All right, if I want to import add and subtract, if I want to do both, I just separate them by comma. All right, and then I could export as many things as that file, I could import as many things as that file exports. Okay, this is going to get everybody. Okay, the difference between a default and a named import and export. Okay, those curly brackets are going to kill all of you at least once or twice.
So it's treating math as an object, and it's just deconstructing it, get add and subtract?
No. So that is a very common misconception people think with this stuff. And Node's modular system works closer to that. This does not work like that. So we are not destructuring it. It looks like it's destructuring, but it does not work the same as destructuring. That's very good question and point, though. Yes, sir.
So we need to use the name that this function is given to the other file.
Yes.
Here, we can't give it our own.
No. So there is a way to rename it, but you always have to start by what its original name was. We'll get to rename it in a minute. Anything else? Very good questions, guys. All right, and then just to see that these work, we could say add to DOM, and then we'll use string template literal, get some good practice for that, and we'll say 50 plus 82 equals, and then we'll call add, and we'll pass it 50 and 82. Okay. In no way, shape, or form would I say this is, if you're really trying to do this, this is how you would want to print out a sentence like that that's talking about adding two numbers together. We are only worried about importing and exporting, because really you'd want that stuff stored in variables and passing it to variables and all that fun stuff. But just in case anybody's shaking their head at my horrible practices up there, I know. All right, and then of course we want to test it to make sure it works. So once you save everything, if you're not using autosave, don't forget to save. Go back to your browser, and then refresh your page, and you should hopefully get, your nice little equation showing that the add function is indeed working. So the main takeaway from all this, yes, sir.
So why use export default? You can only export one thing.
Most commonly we'll be using that, actually. Because normally that's all you really need to do. So, and it's a little bit more flexible. You don't have to worry about the name or anything like that. And like I said, in a lot of cases, like in the jQuery as a whole, the default export is the entire jQuery library. But we could actually pull off pieces. We could specifically just import Ajax by using a named import. So if you only want a piece of a library, that's really where it shines. All right, so a couple other little tricks to be aware of. One, when you have a named don't know anybody in Chino. When you have a named export, you have to call it by its name to import it. That's how it knows what you're trying to get. Because that file exports multiple things, you have to specifically call it by its name. Now, you might run into some collisions. You might have multiple files or multiple libraries that use the same naming convention. Okay? So what you want to do is you want to be able to rename it. So let's say I can't use add because add is already being used in this file or whatever. I could actually say add as and then some other name. Okay. Now when I call it, I have to call it by whatever I renamed it. Okay, and we will be doing this. So we'll run into cases where you actually do need to do it. So it's just a way to rename the variable. You're importing the same exact thing, you're just renaming it to something else. All right. And then one other thing you could do as well is if you know you want to import everything from a given file, there's a way to import everything from a file. And that is import star, which you've all seen the star before, right? CSS file names. It will keep showing up as you have to rename it because you can't just call it star. It's not a valid variable name, so you have to give it some kind of name. And we say as math or whatever we want to call it from the file. And what that will do is that will actually create an object. I know, making it look more like that is doing destructuring that I said wasn't. I know it looks that way, but it's really not, unfortunately. So that will create an object from everything that that file exports. So if I wanted to use add, I would have to say math.add. And we could actually take a look at what it looks like if we console.log. So as a very important side note, this isn't something we're going to be messing with too much, you know, importing everything from a file or anything like that. Not something that comes up too often. One of those things, just kind of file away in the back of your head that you can do it. If you ever needed to do it, you know, ask for help or, you know, Google it. But this isn't something we're going to be doing commonly. I just want to show you guys that you can do it. And if we take a look at that, we see it does indeed still work. And then you can see the object it gives us. And it even tells us that it is an ES module. And then you can see our add and subtract functions there. Now, very important about doing it this way is if you have a default export doesn't have a name. So that shows up ever slightly so different. It's actually pretty intuitive the way it works, but just as a heads up. So if in my math file, I have something that is export default And let's do it as an anonymous function. And we'll say X operator and Y. I always forget with, I always mix this and node up. One works one way, one works the other way. We'll find out. And we'll do a switch based on the operator. And we'll say return. Oops, forgot the case. I was too worried about thinking about. Right, and then we'll do a case for subtraction. All right, and this is, in a very broad sense, kind of how a lot of libraries are set up. You have each individual functionality defined, and then you have an all-encompassing thing that kind of can do everything. Okay? I said in a very loose term. Don't take this gospel, but the concept is similar. So first thing I'm going to show you, and then we're going to backtrack, is the star operator. So the way we left our index file, we used star to import everything from the file. So, but our default is an anonymous function and does not have a name because it doesn't matter when it's the default export. But the nice people that came up with this system, of course, thought of this minor problem. And if we look in our browser, you can see now there is a default thing. So anything that's exported default will be on the default property, because remember, there's going to be one of those per file. Okay? So all your named exports will be by the name you gave them, and then default will be on default. And that is only if you use the star to import everything from a given file. I said, realistically, that is not something you do commonly. Okay? Once again, I'm just showing you that it's possible. Doesn't mean it's something that you should or will be using all the time. A better way to handle that would be to use something a little bit different. So we'll change up our import statement. So the first thing we want is our default math function that does all the math. Okay, so we'll just give it a horrible name of do math. All right, and then if we want to also import some of the named exports from the other file, we do comma and then curly brackets and then tell it what we want from the named export side. So this is a pattern you're going to see a lot where we're getting the default and then still pulling a couple sub things off of it.
So do math is the name.
Is the default, yeah. Yeah, I just made up that name just now, and it could have been anything. It's getting all three. So in this case, it gets all three. Yes, sir.
Does it not work if you put it inside the curly brackets to do math?
It will not. Because anything inside of curly brackets, it's looking for a named export. Now, if you called it default, maybe. Never really thought about it. Default's a reserved word. Can't do that. Nope.
Isn't
always automatically export or import default?
Yes. Yeah, so if you don't use curly brackets, you're going to get whatever the default export was. So that, like I said, that's the key difference between using curly brackets and not using curly brackets. If you're using curly brackets, it's looking for specifically named things. It's looking for stuff by the exact name that you're importing it as. Okay? No curly brackets, you're just saying, hey, give me whatever the default of that file is. And as I promised earlier, this will F with you for a while. What makes it even funner is when you're using libraries, is you don't necessarily know what they export. So either someone has to tell you, or you have to look at their documentation. And kind of keeping all that stuff straight at the beginning can be pretty hard. Don't worry though, eventually this all does make sense. It takes a while, but eventually it does. So change that back to something that works like that. That should work. And then of course we then have our do math. Test that real quick. Do math. And then 22 plus sign. And then another number. All right. And then if you really want to, you can do one more for subtract, just, you know, in case you don't believe me that it'll work. All right. So make sure that your app is working. Right? Should bundle without any errors. If you ever get an error in the console, the browser console, if you ever get a big nasty error message here that somewhere in it says like bundle failed or unable, I think bundle failed or module failed or whatever the actual error message is, something along those lines that couldn't build the project. Sometimes it'll give you a decent error message here, but almost always it will give you a very good error message in the terminal where your dev server is actually running. So if you ever get care about that. Okay, so in this case, it can't find the module I was trying to import. I don't know if this will be a good example or not, actually. It's not. But usually in the terminal here, especially if it's some kind of just really bad code error, it will point exactly to the exact line number and file where the error occurred if it cannot build your project. So if you have some kind of egregious code error, check the terminal. It will actually usually give you really good feedback. And a lot of times, it'll give you better file names and stuff here, too, than what the browser will give you. So just remember to check both places if you're having issues. But that aside, is everybody's example working?
Yes.
Does anybody need help? Here, let me go back. me see your. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so you're just missing the last function. So export default. That'll be my first input. So yeah, you just missed that. Anybody else? Go to this. Oh yeah, man. Yeah. Good on that. So you gotta do one or the other.
Yeah.
Anybody else having trouble? So it's important your code's working for what we're gonna do next. Is that or? All right. So most importantly from all of this, guys, is the curly brackets versus no curly brackets on the import statement. That is the most important takeaway from all of this. And I know I said it's really hard to kind of keep straight in the beginning. Just remember there is a big difference between curly brackets and no curly brackets on your import statements. Okay? No curly brackets, you're saying, hey, give me the default thing. Okay? I want the default thing. With curly brackets, you're saying, hey, I want pieces of the thing.
If for whatever reason, maybe you're just unorganized and you accidentally import the same function twice, will there be an error?
Yes. Yeah, if you use the same name twice, okay, there's a.
Or you import a function and then a couple lines down, you import the same function, just you might not.
Yeah, like a double import. Yeah, that will also error out. It'll let you know. So I want to switch gears a little bit, but don't worry, don't fret. There'll be plenty more importing and exporting going on. But before we go back to any more of that, I want to talk a little bit more about bundling. So if we look at our code in the browser, everyone's good, right?
Yes.
So if you look at your code in the browser and you go to sources, and then there should be on the left dist, and then there is a bundle.js. Okay, this file is 10,000 lines long because it includes the entirety of jQuery because we imported jQuery into our code. When you bundle something, it creates a single file of all the files you made plus any libraries you're importing. Okay, so everything is put into one single file because remember, import and export doesn't work in the browser. So everything has to be in a single file. Okay, and just to prove to you that it is the code we wrote, why did you go clear to the left? Oh, jQuery might be. Let's do find, and where we put a string in there. Okay, you can see buried deep in all this code. Oh, that's where someone puts it at the end. Put it in the beginning. Here is all of your code compiled into a single file. Okay, and it can be pretty crazy looking if you look through it, but you can see like helpers too, like all stuff related to kind of what we need. And if you look in here, you'll find your actual code that you wrote. Like there's us, actually calling our functions. Here's like the add and subtract functions. Okay, you see written exactly how we wrote them. So all your code is buried in there somewhere. Okay. Once again, the point of this is so we can use multiple files, and then everything gets built into a single file that the browser could then run. If you want to get right down to it, it keeps us from having to make a bunch of different script tags in our HTML file. Really boil it down. All right. But what's important about this is when you go to put your site or app or whatever you want to call it onto a server, you have to build this file. Okay, right now it exists only in memory. Because if you look at our actual folder structure in your code editor, we don't even have a dist folder, let alone the bundle file. It doesn't exist. It only exists in memory created by that node server that we have to start. Okay? That is the whole point of the node server, is it's building this file for you and updating it as you make changes to your code. So when you go to deploy something onto a server, you have to essentially build your project or bundle your project. You'll see both used pretty interchangeably. Seems like in recent times, everyone's going more towards build. Bundle was fashionable for a while, and everyone's saying build. Same thing. You're taking all of your project files and then condensing them down to something that the browser could actually read. So where you have your server running, stop it, Control-C. And then we're going to run another npm command. We're going to say npm run. A lot of times with npm scripts, you actually need to put the run keyword. So any predefined script in that package JSON, we'll flip back to that in a second, you normally have to put the run word in front of. There's just a few reserved words that you don't, that are reserved for scripts, like start, like npm start, npm test. I think there's a third one that I can never remember. But bundle is not a reserved script word, so you have to tell it that you're wanting it to run a script, npm run, and then the name of the script you want it to run, bundle. Oh yeah, I keep forgetting about this. So now what I want you guys to type is, I want everyone to do this because everyone got this message, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So webpack -CLI and then enter. I need to fix that. It's something new, but I did it last class too, and I forgot to fix it.
For Windows, it's gonna be blank again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Scary. You never know.
So after it installs the Webpack CLI, how many of you know what CLI is? No? Anyone want to guess? Look. Command line interface. So like Git, NPM itself, all those things are CLIs. After you got that, you should get an output that looks kind of similar to what it looked like before. It's essentially just telling you that it built the project. And we can see that it actually built it. If we look back into our folder structure, we now have this magical dist folder. Now it's a real thing. Now it actually exists. So if you go dist and then bundle.js, here is your project built to a single JavaScript file. And so this is the way React and everything works. So React, you have to run a dev server because it's going to be constantly building the file for you. And then when you go to deploy it, you have to build it into a single file. Now, my project can work with just this index.html file and that bundle file. I can put those two things on a server, and my website would work the exact same way it's been working. Like all the stuff that's inside of app, all the stuff that's inside of node modules, all that stuff doesn't matter anymore for deploying my site. Now, you still put everything onto the server because you don't want to separate files out. But it's important to understand that when your project's actually running on a real server, it's the index file and the bundle file, and whatever other supporting assets and images you have. But all your JavaScript is in a single file. Now, ultimately, that can become a bad thing because, as you can imagine, look how small this project is, and it's 10,000 lines of code. So in a real full-scale project, your bundle file could become over a megabyte, which is really big for a JavaScript file. So when you get into more advanced topics, we won't necessarily be covering them in this class, but there are techniques for actually splitting up the bundle file into smaller chunks and having it load, lazy loading the bundle files and stuff. All much more advanced stuff, though. Not super important right now. But just to prove that this works, and then we'll go to lunch, you should now be able to open this index file how you opened stuff before, directly from the file. And you can see that it indeed runs the JavaScript and everything works. Because it's just loading that bundle file, and that's all it needs to do. It doesn't need a special server to work anymore. But now if you make changes to your code, they're not going to appear here, though.
How bad will this be for Windows computers since it's still trying to bundle? Like,
It's not hurting anything. That's crazy that it's still trying to bundle, though.
Yeah.
right now.
Do we usually download it?
We won't be bundling it a lot, though.
Oh, yeah.
So if it's slow at bundling, that's not that big of a deal. When you do your final project, just do it on someone in your groups that has a faster computer.
This has nothing to do with processing power, does it?
What's that? No, it's hard drive, man. The hard drive matters more than anything. Or if you have really low system memory, because then it would have to be using the hard drive as for memory space. So if we can't store it all in your RAM, then it'll be a problem. All right, guys, a couple last things and we'll go to lunch. So, good news for those of you that are panicking over the bundle thing. Don't worry, that's not something you do often. And like I said, for your final project groups, someone in your group will probably have a Mac or a little bit newer computer that you can bundle it on. Not everybody in your final project needs to be able to bundle it. Okay? And it will work on any computer. It just might take a little bit longer on some than others. Also, one other bit of good news is this is actually using an older version of Webpack, so it's a little bit slower than the newer stuff is anyways. Okay? I don't know if it'll make that big a difference, but it'll make a little bit of a difference. So when we get back from lunch, we are going to talk about classes and extending classes. And in doing so, we'll be using import and export a little bit more just because we're going to make a couple different files. So we'll get a little bit more practice with that. And then, finally, we'll actually start talking about React. Which is actually good because I wasn't expecting to get to it till tomorrow, but I think we might actually make it to it today. You guys enjoy your lunch. I'll see you guys back at 2:30.